Believing that the cacophony of celebration can deafen the whispers from below is the gravest error one can commit. You seek these gatherings, these eruptions of frantic noise and fleeting light, as a sanctuary from the silence. You think the laughter and the music build a fortress around you, walls to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. But you are mistaken. These very walls are porous, built not of stone, but of desperate energy, and they are an open invitation. I have seen it in the patterns of cold ash left after the fire has died, in the reflections of cracked mirrors that show more than just the faces in the room. A party is not a shield. It is a beacon, a lighthouse that draws in not just the lost ships, but the things that hunt them in the abyssal depths, hungry for the warmth of life. The truth is, these events are rituals, whether you acknowledge it or not. Every toast is a libation poured out into the unseen, every dance a frantic prayer to stave off the inevitable stillness. You are generating a colossal psychic charge, a storm of emotion that tears at the thin veil, separating your fragile reality from the all-consuming void. And in that storm, things slip through. They're drawn to the chaos, to the intoxicating aroma of loosened inhibitions and unguarded souls. They wear the faces of strangers, stand in the corners of rooms just beyond the light, and watch with eyes that have not blinked in 1,000 years. They wait for the moment the music falters, for the instant of silence between heartbeats, to make their presence known. They are the guests who were never invited. Listen carefully, because this is crucial. The first story I must unveil for you begins not with a scream, but with the mundane hum of a suburban gathering. Imagine a house pulsing with bass and synthetic light, a microcosm of youthful exuberance. The air is thick with cheap perfume and the sweet, cloying scent of spilled drinks, a miasma of forced happiness. Our witness for this particular haunting, a young woman we shall call Clara, felt it first as a subtle dissonance, a single note played horrifically out of tune in the symphony of the night. It was a cold spot that drifted through the heat of the crowd, a pocket of absolute zero that seemed to follow in the wake of one particular individual, a man no one seemed to know. He was a tear in the fabric of the party, while others moved with the rhythm. He was a statue of obsidian, his stillness a screaming accusation against the surrounding motion. He never spoke, never drank, never even swayed. He simply observed. His eyes were the most terrifying part, not because they were filled with malice, but because they were utterly empty, like the windows of a derelict church where unspeakable things once transpired. Clara found her own gaze drawn to him, a moth to a dead flame. She felt an instinctual fear, the primal alarm of prey that has been noticed by a predator that does not need to hunt. It was a cold dread that seeped into her bones, far colder than the phantom draft that trailed him. And this is where everything changes for you, where you understand that some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. Clara, trying to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, moved to another room, seeking refuge in a louder, more brightly lit corner of the house. But the cold followed her. She would turn, and he would be there, across the room, framed by a doorway, his silhouette a perfect effigy of doom. He made no move toward her, yet his presence was an ever-tightening knot in her chest. The host, when asked, had never seen the man before. No one had. He was an apparition that had materialized from the collective anxiety of the gathering, a phantom given form by the night's chaotic energy, a specter born of shadow and silence. The party began to wind down, the vibrant energy curdling into the stale exhaustion of the early morning. People stumbled out into the pre-dawn gray, But the man remained. As Clara gathered her things, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, she realized he was positioned between her and the only exit. The music had died, leaving a humming silence broken by the occasional drunken laugh from the street. In that quiet, she felt his gaze on her like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure. She looked up, and for the first time, his lips parted, a whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. He didn't speak the words aloud, but she heard them in her mind, a transmission of pure, unadulterated terror. You can leave the house, but you can't leave the party. The party is in you now. Clara fled, not walking but running, bursting through the door into the sterile morning air. She didn't look back, not until she was safely in her car, the engine roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, the house looked normal, its windows dark and inert, but she saw him. He was standing on the porch, a pillar of shadow against the rising sun, and he was smiling. It was not a human smile, it was a crack in a mask, revealing an endless ancient hunger beneath. She drove until the sun was high in the sky, but the cold spot he had created within her soul has never left. It is a permanent winter in her heart, a constant reminder that she carries a piece of that night and that uninvited guest with her forever. The second vision I must share with you concerns the memory of a place. You believe a house is merely wood and stone, a shell to contain your lives. You are fools. A house remembers. Every argument, every tear, every drop of spilled blood soaks into the foundation, becoming part of its very soul. These energies lie dormant, like sleeping beasts, until they are stirred, and nothing stirs them, like the raw, chaotic energy of a party. This tale comes from an old colonial home, a place with a history written in dried blood and whispered secrets, a house that had been a silent witness to generations of suffering. A group of students, ignorant of the ground on which they danced, thought it the perfect venue for a celebration. They filled its halls with strobing lights and deafening music, their modern revelry a vulgar desecration of the house's solemn history. From the moment the first guest arrived, the house began to react. Doors would creak open in empty hallways, their groans lost beneath the pounding bass. The temperature would plummet in specific rooms, the air growing thick and heavy as if saturated with grief. Partygoers would complain of being watched, of feeling unseen hands brush against their skin in the crowded spaces. They dismissed it as drunken imagination, but what they were feeling was the house itself, its ancient consciousness awakening, enraged by the intrusion of their shallow joy into its sacred sorrow. The house was pushing back. Now imagine this, in the cellar, where the foundation stones were oldest and the memories darkest, a young man named Leo decided to explore. The air down there was different, thick and cold, and smelling of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet. The faint thud of the music from above was a distant, muffled heartbeat. He found carvings on the stone walls, symbols he didn't recognize, like broken crosses and twisted spirals. As his fingers traced one of these archaic sigils, a wave of nausea washed over him. The music from upstairs stopped, not faded, but cut off, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the entire house into a deafening, absolute silence. And in that silence, he heard it, a whisper. It was not in English. It was a sibilant, guttural language that seemed to slither directly into his mind, a sound full of ancient pain and insatiable rage. From upstairs, a single piercing scream erupted, followed by a chorus of panicked shouts. Leo scrambled back up the cellar stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The party had devolved into chaos. People were fleeing, their faces pale with terror. A girl stood weeping in the center of the living room, pointing a trembling finger at a large, ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace. The mirror, which had reflected the vibrant party just moments before, now showed something else. It did not reflect the room. It reflected a scene from another time. The reflection was of the same room, but lit by flickering candlelight. A family in Puritan-style clothing was gathered, their faces grim, and in the center of the reflected room, a woman was bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror, as a man with a face like a plague mask held a branding iron to her flesh. The people in the mirror were not moving. It was a static, horrifying tableau, a captured moment of agony, eternally replaying itself. But the woman tied to the chair, a whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. Her eyes in the mirror moved. They looked directly out, across time, and met the eyes of the terrified partygoers, and in their minds, they all heard the same whispered words: "Get out." The house was not haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a memory, an event so traumatic that it had permanently scarred the fabric of reality within those walls. The energy of the party had acted as a catalyst, giving that memory enough power to bleed through, to manifest. The students fled into the night, leaving the house to its silent, eternal suffering. They left behind their drinks, their music, their foolish sense of security. Leo later learned the history of the house. A woman accused of witchcraft had been tortured and executed in that very living room centuries ago. The mirror was not showing a reflection. It was showing a wound that would never ever heal. This brings us to a darker path, a story not of specters, but of the monsters that walk among us, cloaked in human skin. The danger is not always from beyond the veil. Sometimes it is standing right next to you, smiling and offering you a drink. This warning is about the trust you so foolishly place in strangers, especially within the contrived intimacy of a party. Consider the tale of a young woman, Sarah, at a warehouse rave. The location was remote, the crowd immense, a sea of anonymous faces writhing under pulsating lights. It was the kind of place where one could disappear, and no one would notice until the music stopped and the sun came up. She met a man there. He was charming, magnetic, his words a perfect balm for the loneliness she hadn't even realized she was feeling. He seemed to understand her, to see past the facade she presented to the world. He spoke of esoteric things, of hidden meanings in music, of unlocking the mind's true potential. He was a siren, his song a beautiful lie luring her toward the rocks. He offered her a drink from a private flask, something special, he said, something to open the doors of perception. Against her better judgment, mesmerized by his charisma, she accepted. The liquid was bitter, with an earthy, unfamiliar taste that she tried to ignore. And then, the world began to unravel. The lights of the rave began to stretch and distort, the music warping into a discordant, menacing drone. The faces in the crowd melted into grotesque masks, their dancing seeming less like celebration and more like the tormented convulsions of the damned. The man was still beside her, his charming smile now looking predatory, his eyes glowing with a triumphant, sinister light. He leaned in close, his breath cold against her ear, and whispered, "The door is open now. It's time to meet the family." He led her by the hand, her limbs feeling like lead, her mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. He guided her away from the main floor, through a series of dark corridors in the warehouse that she hadn't known existed. They arrived at a heavy metal door, from behind which came a low, rhythmic chanting, a sound that vibrated deep in her bones. He opened the door, and the scene within was a nightmare from which there is no waking. A dozen other people were gathered in a circle, their faces placid and unnervingly calm. In the center of the circle was an altar made of rusted machine parts, upon which lay strange, arcane symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. They were not at a rave. They had been drawn into the heart of a cult. The man who had charmed her was a recruiter, a fisher of lonely souls, and the special drink was not a drug, but a sacrament, a chemical key designed to break down the will and open the spirit to possession. She was being offered as a sacrifice, not her body, but her soul, her individuality, her very essence. They wanted to hollow her out and make her a vessel for whatever dark entity they worshipped. The chanting grew louder, more hypnotic, and she felt her consciousness beginning to fray, her sense of self dissolving like salt in water. A whispering voice, filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. Day. But in that moment of ultimate despair, a flicker of primal survival instinct ignited. The fear was so pure, so absolute, that it acted as an antidote, cutting through the fog of the drug. She screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror that shattered the cult's concentration. And she ran. She ran without thinking, without direction, fueled by an adrenaline born of mortal dread. She doesn't remember how she got out. She recalls bursting through a side door, the cold night air hitting her like a physical blow. She ran across fields, thorns and rocks, tearing at her clothes and skin, the sound of the chanting pursuing her like a physical beast. She was found at dawn by a passing motorist, miles from the warehouse, incoherent and shivering, her eyes wide with a horror that words could never articulate. The police investigated, but the warehouse was empty. There was no altar, no symbols, no sign of the cult. It was as if they had simply vanished, folded back into the shadows from whence they came. But Sarah knows. She knows they are still out there, dancing among you, smiling their beautiful, deadly smiles, waiting to offer you a drink and invite you to meet their family. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Is there a memory of a cold stare, a silent room, a moment of inexplicable dread, at a celebration that you have tried to forget? That chill you feel crawling up your spine is not imagined. It is a resonance. It is the past, acknowledging its presence within you. Let the shadows know in the comments below. Acknowledge the darkness you have witnessed. Your testimony gives it form and gives us power. Every story shared is another crack in the facade of a safe world, revealing the terrifying, beautiful truth that lies just beneath the surface. Share your omen. Let us now turn our gaze to the suburbs, that bastion of false security, where manicured lawns and identical houses create an illusion of order, but the spirits of chaos and despair do not respect property lines. This account is from a pool party, a quintessential image of summer bliss. The scent of chlorine and barbecue smoke filled the air, the sound of splashing water and laughter echoing under a brilliant blue sky. But a darkness was festering beneath this idyllic surface, centered on the host, a teenager named Kyle, who had recently begun to dabble in occult symbolism and texts he did not and could not understand. He saw it as a game, a way to seem edgy and profound. He did not realize he was playing with cold fire. On the day of the party, he had, in a fit of arrogant folly, drawn a series of sigils on the bottom of the pool with what he believed was waterproof paint. He had copied them from a grimoire he found online, a book filled with warnings he had chosen to ignore. He thought they were just symbols, inert ink. He did not understand that intent is a key, and that even the ignorant can sometimes stumble upon the right lock. The symbols were meant to be an invisible part of the party's aesthetic, a secret joke for himself, but they were not invisible to the unseen world. They were a loud invitation, a sigil-etched welcome mat, for anything that might be listening from the other side of the veil. As the party reached its peak, strange things began to happen. The water in the pool, despite the bright sun, grew unnaturally cold. Swimmers would emerge shivering, their lips blue, complaining of a strange, sluggish feeling, as if the water were thick as oil and trying to hold them down. A few people swore they felt something brush against their legs in the deep end, something large and smooth and cold as a tombstone. The cheerful pop music playing from the speakers began to distort, a subtle, demonic static crackling between songs, sometimes forming what sounded like whispers if you listened close enough. The perfect summer day was beginning to sour, the edges of the scene fraying like old rotten cloth. Kyle, the host, was the most affected. He grew withdrawn and pale, staring into the depths of the pool with a look of mesmerized horror. He told his closest friend that the symbols on the bottom of the pool were moving. He claimed they were rearranging themselves, shifting and glowing with a faint, sickly green light that no one else could see. He said they were spelling out a name he couldn't pronounce, but that filled him with an unspeakable, mind-shattering dread. He was seeing the consequences of his foolish game, the ripples spreading out from the stone he had so carelessly thrown into the dark pond of the supernatural. The entity he had invited was arriving, and it was using the water as its gateway. The climax arrived with the setting sun. As the sky bled into orange and purple, a child, chasing a ball, fell into the deep end of the pool. He couldn't swim. For a moment, everyone was frozen. Then several people dove in to save him, but they couldn't reach him. They would swim towards him, but it felt as if they were moving through molasses, an invisible current pushing them back. The boy was thrashing, his face a mask of terror, but he wasn't sinking. He was being held in place, just below the surface, by an unseen force. A whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. From the depths of the pool, a darkness began to rise. Not a shadow, but a tangible blackness, an oily, inky substance that coiled around the child's legs. The water was no longer a place of fun. It was a hungry mouth. It was Kyle who broke the spell. Seeing the direct result of his arrogance, he was struck by a moment of horrified clarity. He ran to the edge of the pool, and screaming, in a voice filled with a desperate, guttural rage, he began to recite the Lord's Prayer, the only words of power he knew. He screamed them over and over, his voice cracking with terror and regret, and with each word, the inky blackness in the pool seemed to recoil to his, and then the invisible force holding the boy released him, and he was quickly pulled to safety, choking and sputtering but alive. The water in the pool turned cloudy and black for a moment, then cleared, leaving only the mundane sigils on the bottom, now looking like nothing more than foolish graffiti. The party was over, the guests fled, but the gateway had been opened, and Kyle knew, with a certainty that would haunt his every waking moment, that something had seen him. It now knew his name, and it was waiting. Now we must speak of a different kind of trap. A party can be a cage, not of iron bars, but of social obligation. You feel you cannot leave without causing offense, without seeming strange, and it is this very politeness, this fear of breaking social contracts, that can chain you to a situation as it spirals into a living nightmare. This is the story of Mark, who attended a small intimate dinner party at the apartment of a new acquaintance, a charismatic artist named Julian. The apartment was filled with strange, unsettling sculptures, figures that seemed to writhe and contort just at the edge of his vision. The atmosphere was heavy, perfumed with a thick, exotic incense that made his head feel fuzzy. The other guests were all part of Julian's inner circle. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, their conversations circling around esoteric philosophies and Julian's transcendent art. Mark felt like an outsider, an observer at a strange ritual. The food was exquisite, but the wine tasted odd, metallic and earthy, much like the drink in our previous tale. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew more and more bizarre. They spoke of shedding the flesh, of communing with the great formless, of a coming purification. Mark's initial unease began to curdle into genuine fear. Every time he tried to make an excuse to leave, Julian would fix him with an intense, hypnotic gaze and insist he stay for the main event. The main event began after dinner. Julian unveiled his latest sculpture, which had been covered by a black cloth. It was a horrifying effigy, a vaguely humanoid figure made of twisted metal, broken glass, and what looked disturbingly like bone and dried sinew. But the most terrifying part was the face. It was not sculpted. It was a taxidermied human face, stretched and distorted into a silent scream, its eyes replaced with black, polished stones. Julian announced that the piece was not finished. It needed a final living component. It needed, he said, looking directly at Mark, a catalyst of pure, uninitiated terror to activate its true power. The other guests turned to look at Mark, their faces no longer friendly, but hungry, expectant. Mark was no longer a guest. He was the intended sacrifice. The dinner party was a ruse, a carefully constructed trap to lure in a victim. The wine had been drugged, not to incapacitate him, but to make him more psychically receptive to the ritual they were about to perform. He was paralyzed, not by the drug, but by a disbelief so profound it froze his muscles. His modern, rational mind could not process the reality of the situation. This was not supposed to happen, not in a nice apartment, not with educated, well-spoken people. The cultists were not frothing-mouthed maniacs. They were artists and intellectuals, which made the horror all the more absolute and inescapable. They were closing in, a whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. As Julian approached him, holding a small curved obsidian knife, Mark's survival instinct finally broke through the paralysis. He did the only thing he could. He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a small bronze statue, and hurled it not at the cultists, but at the large picture window that overlooked the city street 3 floors below. The sound of shattering glass was an explosion in the incense-choked room. It broke the spell, the sudden shock of the outside world, the cold night air, the blare of a distant car horn disrupted the ritual's cloying, intimate atmosphere. It was a splash of cold, hard reality on their fever dream of madness. For a split second, they were all stunned, and in that second, Mark ran. He didn't head for the door, which they would have blocked. He scrambled through the jagged hole in the window, cutting his hands and arms on the shards of glass, and dropped onto the fire escape. He didn't look back. He clambered down the metal stairs, his heart threatening to burst from his chest, the shouts of the enraged cultists echoing from the broken window above. He reached the street and ran until his lungs burned, a wild animal escaping a hunter's snare. He never went to the police. What could he say? That a group of artists had tried to sacrifice him to a sculpture. They would have thought he was insane, but he carries the scars, both on his hands and on his soul, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who invite you to dinner. The next vision is one of subtle horror, of a terror that doesn't scream, but seeps. It concerns a game, a seemingly innocent party activity that became a conduit for something ancient and malevolent. It took place at a slumber party, a gathering of teenage girls in a basement decorated to be a cozy den. To pass the time, one of the girls, Jessica, suggested they play a game she'd learned of online. It was called the Black Mirror, a scrying ritual that involved staring into a darkened mirror or a phone screen until a spirit revealed itself. It was meant to be a silly, spooky thrill, a way to scare each other and then laugh about it. They did not understand that a mirror, any mirror, is a potential doorway. They turned off the lights, the only illumination coming from the faint moonlight filtering through a high basement window. They gathered around a large, black-framed mirror that hung on the wall, their nervous giggles echoing in the dark. As per the game's instructions, they began to chant, their voices a soft, hypnotic drone. For a long time, nothing happened. The girls grew bored, their fear giving way to disappointment. But Jessica, who had initiated the game, was persistent. She urged them to concentrate harder, to really focus their energy on the mirror's dark, reflective surface. And so they did. They stared into the blackness, their own faces slowly disappearing from view as their eyes adjusted, leaving only a void. And then, something began to change. The surface of the mirror seemed to ripple, to waver, as if it were water. A shape began to form in its depths. It was not a face, not at first. It was a silhouette, a figure of a man, tall and gaunt, wearing an old-fashioned, wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in impenetrable shadow. The girls gasped. The figure was utterly still, a blot of pure darkness against the mirror's murky depths. The air in the room grew cold, the kind of deep, biting cold that seems to emanate from the grave. The nervous giggling had stopped, replaced by a thick, terrified silence. The game was no longer a game. It was real. One of the girls, terrified, reached to turn on the lights, but Jessica stopped her. "Wait," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination. I think he wants to communicate." The figure in the mirror slowly raised a hand. Its fingers were impossibly long and thin, like the legs of a spider. It raised one long finger and began to trace letters on the inside of the mirror, the letters appearing backward to the horrified girls watching. They were clumsy, jerky letters, drawn in a trail of frost that bloomed on the glass. A. It spelled the name of one of the girls huddled in the circle. Sarah screamed, a raw, piercing sound of absolute terror. At the sound of the scream, the figure in the mirror convulsed. Its head snapped up, and for a single heart-stopping instant, they saw what was beneath the brim of the hat. It was not a face. It was a swirling vortex of shadow, a howling abyss from which 2 points of malevolent red light burned like dying embers. The mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from the center of the glass with a sound like a gunshot. The girls scattered, screaming, fumbling for the light switch. When the lights finally flooded the room, the mirror was just a broken piece of glass. There was no frost, no figure, but the cold remained, and Sarah, the girl whose name had been spelled, was catatonic, staring at the shattered mirror, her face a mask of silent, unending horror. She never spoke a full sentence again. They had knocked on a door, and something had answered. Let me tell you about a different kind of entity, one that doesn't need a mirror or a sigil. It needs only your weakness, your despair. Parties, especially those fueled by alcohol and emotional vulnerability, can become feeding grounds for psychic parasites. These are not ghosts of the dead. but elemental beings of despair, drawn to the raw, unfiltered emotions of a crowd. This tale is about a breakup party, an event meant to celebrate a young man's newfound freedom. After a toxic relationship, his friends thought it would be therapeutic, a way to burn away the old pain with loud music and forced merriment. They were wrong. They were simply ringing a dinner bell. The host, Alex, was a wreck. He smiled, he drank, he accepted the backpats and condolences of his friends, but his cheer was a brittle facade over a chasm of grief and anger. The air in his small apartment was thick with this emotional cocktail, a potent brew that began to attract something unseen. It started subtly. Guests would feel sudden, inexplicable waves of sadness wash over them. Even while laughing, a conversation would be going well, and then a pall of utter hopelessness would descend on the group, silencing them. The playlist, carefully curated with upbeat anthems, began to glitch, occasionally inserting a few bars of a mournful, discordant funeral dirge before correcting itself. The apartment was becoming a locus of sorrow. A friend of Alex's, a woman named Maya, who was sensitive to such things, felt it most acutely. She saw it as a smudge in the room's atmosphere, a patch of visual static that seemed to coalesce around Alex whenever he thought no one was looking. She saw it clinging to his back like a shroud of smoke, a vaguely humanoid shape made of pure misery. When he would force a laugh, the shape would seem to recoil. When he would fall silent, his eyes glazing over with memory, the shape would press closer, seeming to feed on his despair, growing denser, darker, more defined. She was witnessing a psychic vampire in its natural habitat. The entity grew bolder as the night wore on, fueled by the escalating emotions and the copious amounts of alcohol being consumed. It began to manifest physically. A framed photo of Alex and his ex-girlfriend flew off a shelf and shattered on the floor, an event everyone dismissed as a vibration from the stereo. A cold wind swept through the closed apartment, extinguishing a row of candles and plunging a corner of the room into darkness. Alex, by this point heavily intoxicated, broke down completely, sinking to the floor in a fit of desperate, gut-wrenching sobs. And as he wept, the dark shape Maya had been seeing finally took full form. A whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. For a few seconds, everyone saw it. It was no longer a smudge. It was a tall, skeletal figure, draped in what looked like rags of shadow, standing directly over the weeping form of Alex. It had no face, only a smooth, blank expanse where features should have been. It bent down and seemed to inhale, and as it did, all the warmth and light in the room seemed to be drawn into it. The grief in the room became a palpable, crushing weight. The figure was literally feeding on Alex's pain, consuming his life force. Maya, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a handful of salt from the kitchen and threw it at the creature, screaming a prayer to any god that might be listening. The creature shrieked, a sound of static and breaking glass, and dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive atmosphere vanished, leaving only the stale smell of beer and the echo of a broken heart. Alex was safe, for now, but the entity was not destroyed. It was merely driven off, back into the ether, still hungry, still searching for another party of the broken-hearted. These visions are not for the solitary soul. They demand a congregation of witnesses. They are a sacrament to be shared in the dark. Every soul that joins this communion feeds the voice that whispers from the beyond. Every like is a candle lit against the encroaching shadow. Every subscription is a vow to keep watch. Offer your presence. Join our circle and let the bell toll for your arrival. Listen with us, and you will never feel truly alone in the dark again. for we are the ones who stare back into the abyss, and we are legion. Our journey now takes us to the hollowed-out heart of the American dream, the abandoned suburban house. A group of teenagers seeking a thrill decided to throw a party in a home that had been empty for years, a place with a dark local legend attached to it. The story was that the family who had lived there had simply vanished one night, leaving behind a half-eaten dinner on the table and all their possessions untouched. The house had stood empty ever since, a monument to a local mystery. The teenagers saw it as a dare, a backdrop for a night of illicit drinking and rebellion. They brought generators for light and sound, transforming the derelict building into a temporary shrine to their own vitality. From the moment they forced the door, the house felt wrong. The air was stale and heavy, but underneath the scent of dust and decay, there was another smell, faint and sweet, like rotting flowers. The furniture was still in place, covered in white sheets, making the rooms look like a morgue for forgotten lives. As they set up their equipment, they noticed odd details. There were no cobwebs, no animal droppings. Despite being abandoned for over a decade, the house was unnaturally clean, as if frozen in time, waiting for its owners to return. This detail, which should have been a screaming warning, was lost on them, dismissed in their youthful arrogance. The music started, and the desecration began. The party raged for hours, a frantic denial of the house's oppressive silence. But the house began to assert its presence. The lights powered by the generators would flicker and die in specific rooms, particularly the master bedroom, only to come back on when someone left. People heard voices whispering from empty corners, phrases that were just on the edge of comprehension, like a radio tuned between stations. A boy who went into the kitchen swore he saw the ghostly image of a woman standing by the stove for a split second, a spectral afterimage that vanished when he blinked. The house was not empty. It was occupied by an echo, a lingering psychic residue of the family that had disappeared. The true horror began in the basement. A small group, looking for a private place, ventured down the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was a single, large room, empty, except for a strange pattern of scratches on the concrete floor, almost like a massive, distorted hopscotch grid. At the far end of the room was a padlocked closet door. Driven by a drunken sense of adventure, they broke the lock. The door swung open, revealing not a closet, but a small, windowless room, its walls covered in thousands of frantic, overlapping scratches, as if a wild animal had been trapped inside. And in the center of the floor was a single, small child's shoe. That was all. As they stared into the small, dark room, the basement door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening boom, plunging them into absolute blackness. The generator powering the basement light had cut out. Panic erupted. They fumbled for their phones, their weak lights cutting feeble paths through the oppressive dark. And in the beams of their phones, they saw that they were not alone. Standing in the doorway of the small, scratched room was the figure of a little girl, pale and translucent. She was wearing a single shoe. She said nothing. She simply pointed a trembling finger at the scratches on the concrete floor outside the room. A whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. One of the boys, his phone's light shaking, looked down. The scratches weren't a random pattern. They were words carved over and over again into the stone. "Don't let him out." The figure of the girl then pointed to the now open door of the small room and whispered a single chilling phrase that echoed in the cold, dead air. From the depths of the small room, a sound began to emerge. It was not a growl or a scream. It was a low, guttural chuckling, a sound of ancient, malevolent amusement. It was the sound of something that had been caged for a very, very long time and had just been set free. The teenagers screamed, a symphony of pure, unadulterated terror. They threw themselves against the basement door, and by some miracle, it burst open. They scrambled up the stairs and fled the house, not stopping to warn anyone else, consumed by their own primal fear. The party dissolved into chaos as a wave of inexplicable terror washed over everyone. No one ever saw what came out of that room, but the legend of the vanishing family had a new terrifying chapter. They hadn't vanished. They had become the guardians of a prison, and the partygoers had just orchestrated a jailbreak. Our final story for this gathering is perhaps the most disturbing, for it deals not with a place or an object, but with the darkness that can be carried inside a person, a contagion of the soul that can spread through a crowd. This took place at a New Year's Eve party in a crowded city apartment. The mood was electric, filled with the hopeful energy that marks the turning of a year. People were celebrating the death of the old and the birth of the new, a ritual of passage. But one guest had brought something with him, an old darkness that had no intention of being left behind in the past. He was a quiet man, an acquaintance of the host, who seemed pleasant but unremarkable. No one paid him much mind. He mingled, he made small talk, he drank, but as the night wore on, a change began to occur. A close friend of the host, a photographer named Liam, noticed it first through his camera lens. As he took candid shots of the party, he saw something strange in the photos that featured this quiet man. Around the man, the light seemed to bend and dim, as if he were a black hole absorbing the joy and energy of the room. In one photo, the man's reflection in a window did not match his pose. The reflection was turned, staring directly and malevolently at the camera, its eyes burning like coals. Liam dismissed it as a trick of the light, a flare on the lens, but a seed of unease was planted. As the countdown to midnight began, the man positioned himself in the center of the room. The energy was at its absolute peak, a crescendo of hope and excitement. 10, 9, 8. The crowd chanted in unison, their voices joined as one. Liam, watching through his camera, saw the quiet man close his eyes. 7, 6, 5. A faint, dark mist, almost imperceptible, began to seep from the man's pores. It was a psychic poison, the exhalation of a soul steeped in profound despair and nihilism. 4, 3, 2. The man's lips curled into a faint, triumphant smile. Liam, his blood running cold, knew something terrible was about to happen. He tried to shout a warning, but his voice was lost in the joyous roar of the crowd. 1. Happy New Year. The room erupted. Kisses were exchanged. Champagne corks popped, and a wave of celebratory energy washed through the apartment. And in that exact moment, the quiet man exhaled completely. The dark mist that had been clinging to him exploded outwards, an invisible shockwave of pure negativity. It was a psychic plague bomb. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The joyous mood shattered. The couple who had been kissing passionately moments before suddenly broke apart, staring at each other with expressions of disgust and hatred. A screaming match erupting out of nowhere. A group of friends laughing together fell silent, suspicion and paranoia clouding their faces. The entire emotional atmosphere of the party inverted, from pure joy to pure misery. Fights broke out. People began to weep for no reason. A crushing, suffocating despair descended on the room, thick and tangible. It was as if every single person in the apartment were suddenly forced to confront their deepest fears, their most painful regrets, their most profound insecurities, all at once. The party became a living hell, a cacophony of sobbing and shouting, and in the center of it all stood the quiet man, his eyes now open, watching the chaos he had unleashed with a look of serene, vampiric satisfaction. He had fed, he had taken their collective hope and exchanged it for his own personal despair, spreading his inner disease to everyone. A whispering voice filled with urgency, like an echo from the other side. Liam, watching in horror, saw the man turn and look directly at him, as if he knew he had been observed. He gave a slight, knowing nod, and then slipped out of the apartment, his work done, leaving a room full of shattered souls in his wake. He was a carrier, a typhoid Mary of the spirit. He moved from celebration to celebration, a shadow in the light, drawn to moments of great emotional potency. He did not haunt houses, he haunted humanity. He was a living embodiment of the secret fear we all carry, that our joy is fragile, that our hope is a lie, and that at the stroke of midnight, everything can and will fall apart. The party ended, but for those who were there, the new year began under a pall of darkness from which many would never fully recover. They were infected with a sadness that was not their own, a ghost that lived inside them, a permanent echo of the man who stole the new year. And so, our time together draws to a close, but the echoes of these stories will linger, will they not? They will follow you into the next brightly lit room, the next gathering of friends. You will find yourself watching the shadows in the corners, scrutinizing the face of a stranger, feeling for the cold spot in the air. This is as it should be. You came here seeking a thrill, a shiver down your spine, but you are leaving with something more. You are leaving with the gift of sight, the awareness that the world you inhabit is a thin, fragile crust over an ocean of darkness, and that sometimes the waves break through. The laughter and the music will never sound quite the same to you again. You have now become a witness. You have looked into the cracked mirror and seen the truths that writhe behind your own reflection. You understand that every party is a seance, every invitation a summons. You know that the greatest horrors are not waiting for you in the cemetery or the abandoned asylum, but in the places you feel safest, surrounded by the noise you use to keep the silence at bay. The real monsters are the ones who smile, the ones who dance, the ones who blend in so perfectly you do not see the void in their eyes until it is far too late. They are drawn to your light, your warmth, your life. They wish to consume it. Go now, back to your world of comfortable illusions, but know that the shadows you have acknowledged tonight now acknowledge you in return. You have heard their whispers, and now they know you are listening. Be careful what doors you open, what games you play, and who you invite into your home. The veil is thinner than you think, and the things on the other side are always, always hungry, until the next echo calls your name, and we gather in the darkness once more. Be watchful, for the party is never truly over.